June 12, 1944. Colonel Werner Albrecht stood in what remained of a Norman farmhouse, watching through binoculars as American trucks formed an unbroken stream along the coastal road below. 6 days had passed since the invasion, and what Albrecht observed contradicted every briefing he had received about Allied logistics vulnerabilities. According to German intelligence estimates, the invading forces should be experiencing critical supply shortages by now. The beaches should be congested with undelivered material, the narrow roads should be creating bottlenecks, and the lack of port facilities should be strangling the flow of reinforcements and supplies. Instead, Albrecht watched as an endless convoy moved with mechanical precision, each vehicle spaced at precise intervals, each loaded with specific cargo, all moving toward the expanding front lines. He had been counting for over an hour and had lost track after the 400th truck passed. This was just one road among dozens. Albrecht lowered his binoculars and turned to his aide, Lieutenant Joseph Brenner, a young officer who had graduated top of his class from the War Academy just 18 months earlier. "Tell me again what we were taught about amphibious operations and their logistics limitations," Albrecht said quietly. Brenner recited from memory. Amphibious invasions are inherently supply-constrained operations. Forces must rely on what they bring with them until ports can be captured and opened. The attackers are most vulnerable in the first week when their supplies are limited and defenders can exploit logistics weaknesses. Historical examples show that invasion forces typically cannot sustain major operations beyond their beachhead until at least 2 weeks after initial landing. Albrecht nodded slowly. "And what we are observing?" Brenner hesitated before answering. "What we are observing appears to be a complete inversion of those principles, sir. They are not supply-constrained. They are bringing supplies faster than they can use them." The mystery of how the Americans were achieving this would have been solved if Albrecht could have observed what was happening just offshore. The Allies had created an artificial harbor called Mulberry, an engineering marvel consisting of enormous concrete caissons that had been towed across the English Channel and sunk in precise positions to create a breakwater and docking facilities. These artificial ports allowed cargo ships to unload directly onto French soil without waiting to capture established harbors. Simultaneously, a fleet of specialized landing craft was operating around the clock, ferrying supplies from ships anchored offshore directly onto the beaches. But the artificial harbors were only part of the solution. The Americans had also developed a comprehensive system for rapidly moving supplies inland once they were unloaded. Engineer battalions worked continuously to improve roads, build temporary bridges, and create bypass routes around bottlenecks. Military police directed traffic with the precision of city traffic controllers, ensuring that supply trucks moved forward while empty vehicles returned by different routes. Fuel trucks painted with specific markings delivered to designated units on schedules coordinated down to the hour. Ammunition trucks carried color-coded loads that allowed for rapid sorting at distribution points. Major Klaus Richter, a quartermaster officer with the 352nd Infantry Division, had been captured on June 9 during fighting near Corentin. His journey from the front lines to a temporary prisoner compound gave him an unprecedented view of American logistics operations. What struck him immediately was the casual abundance that permeated everything. The guards who escorted him carried weapons that appeared factory new. Their uniforms showed no signs of patching or repair. They ate from ration packs that they opened, consumed partially, and then discarded with the remainder still inside. At the prisoner compound, Richter and his fellow captives were fed better than German frontline troops had eaten in months. White bread, canned meat, cheese, chocolate, coffee with real sugar. One of the guards, a corporal from Iowa, explained through a translator that this was standard K rations, the basic field ration issued to every American soldier. Richter had spent years managing supply allocations for his division, carefully calculating how to stretch limited resources to maintain combat effectiveness. The idea that an army could simply discard perfectly good food because it was slightly stale was incomprehensible to him. What Richter could not know was that his observations represented just a tiny fraction of the logistics machine Eisenhower had created. By the end of June 1944, less than a month after the invasion, over 850,000 troops had been landed in Normandy along with 148,000 vehicles and 570,000 tons of supplies. These numbers would have been impressive for a year-long build-up. Achieving them in weeks while fighting a determined enemy represented something entirely new in military history. The scale became even more remarkable when considering that Normandy was just one of multiple active theaters being supplied simultaneously. Colonel Heinrich von Manstein, a logistics coordinator at German High Command, spent his days compiling reports from all fronts trying to understand the full scope of what Germany faced. The numbers he gathered painted a picture of overwhelming American material superiority. In Italy, American Fifth Army was sustaining operations up the peninsula with supply lines that never seemed to falter. In the Pacific, American forces were conducting island-hopping campaigns that required shipping supplies across thousands of miles of ocean to establish bases on remote atolls. And now in France, the Normandy invasion was being sustained with a flow of material that exceeded the consumption of entire German army groups. Von Manstein created a comprehensive comparison chart that he presented to the High Command in July 1944. On one side, he listed German logistics capabilities, production rates, and supply reserves. On the other side, he placed the best available estimates of American capabilities. The disparities were stark in every category. Where Germany could field approximately 150 divisions with severe supply constraints, the Americans were supporting operations that would eventually involve over 300 divisions worth of troops when counting all theaters combined. Where German truck production struggled to replace combat losses and where American factories were producing trucks faster than they could be shipped overseas. The psychological impact of these revelations rippled through the German officer corps. Captain Ernst Vogel, an artillery officer who had fought with distinction in Poland, France, and Russia, found his confidence eroding as he faced American forces in Normandy. "We were told that American soldiers were soft, that they relied too much on equipment rather than fighting spirit," he wrote in his diary. But what good is fighting spirit when the enemy fires 10 artillery shells for every one of ours? When their tanks never run out of fuel while ours sit immobile? When they have air support on call while our aircraft never appear? Vogel's artillery battalion had started the Normandy campaign with 18 guns. By mid-July, only 6 remained operational. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Replacement guns never arrived. Ammunition allocations grew more meager each week. His crews were told to make every shell count, to fire only when targets were certain. Meanwhile, American artillery fired preparatory barrages that lasted hours, saturating entire grid squares with high explosives before infantry even advanced. The mathematical reality was inescapable. The Americans could afford to waste ammunition, while Germans could not afford to use what they had. The breaking point for many German officers came with the realization that the logistics disparity was not temporary or localized but systemic and permanent. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Weber commanded a panzer battalion that had been held in reserve for the counterattack that German High Command insisted would throw the Allies back into the sea. When his battalion finally received orders to move toward the front in late June, Weber discovered that the logistics situation had deteriorated beyond repair. His tanks had enough fuel to reach the battle area but not enough to maneuver once there. Promised ammunition resupply never materialized. Replacement parts for maintenance were unavailable. Weber's battalion made it to within 15 kilometers of the front before American fighter bombers caught them on an open road. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, 2/3 of his tanks were destroyed or disabled. The survivors had no choice but to abandon their vehicles and retreat on foot. "We were not defeated by enemy tanks or infantry," Weber later wrote from a prisoner of war camp. "We were defeated by an enemy who controlled the sky, who had unlimited ammunition for their aircraft, who could afford to send dozens of planes to attack a single column because they had hundreds more where those came from." The capture of Cherbourg on June 27 marked a significant milestone in Allied logistics operations. The port, though heavily damaged by German demolitions, gave the Allies access to facilities that could handle larger cargo ships. American engineers worked with remarkable speed to clear obstacles, repair damaged infrastructure, and restore the port to operational status. Within weeks, Cherbourg was handling thousands of tons of cargo daily. German observers monitoring Allied radio traffic could hardly believe the efficiency reports they intercepted. What should have taken months of reconstruction was accomplished in weeks. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and began their rapid advance across France, the full scope of Eisenhower's logistics achievement became undeniable. General Oberst von Schreiber, who had laughed at American logistics plans 17 months earlier, now sat in his Berlin office reading situation reports with growing despair. The Americans were advancing faster than German forces had during their invasion of France in 1940, and they were doing so while maintaining full logistics support. Their columns never halted for lack of fuel. Their artillery never went silent for lack of shells. Their soldiers never went hungry. Von Schreiber requested a meeting with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command. The meeting took place in late August, just as Paris was being liberated. Von Schreiber laid out his analysis with brutal honesty. "We are not losing this war because of tactical failures or lack of courage," he told Keitel. "We are losing because we fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. The Americans have created a military logistics system that operates on principles we did not believe possible. They have eliminated supply constraints as a limiting factor in operations." Keitel, ever the loyal servant of Hitler, rejected von Schreiber's assessment. "Defeatist talk," he snapped. "The Americans are overextended. Their supply lines are stretched. Winter will slow them down. Our new weapons will turn the tide." Von Schreiber left the meeting knowing that the leadership would not accept reality until it was far too late. The evidence was overwhelming, but ideology and wishful thinking proved stronger than facts. He returned to his office and began documenting everything he had learned about American logistics capabilities, not for the current war which he now believed was lost, but for future military historians who might study how such a massive miscalculation could have occurred. Major Paul Schneider, an engineer officer captured during the retreat from Paris, experienced the reality of American logistics from a different perspective. As a prisoner being transported to the coast for eventual shipment to England, Schneider traveled through newly liberated French territory. What he observed astounded him. The Americans were not just sustaining their advancing forces but were simultaneously beginning to rebuild French infrastructure. Engineer units were repairing bridges, clearing roads, restoring rail lines. Supply depots were being established not just for military use but to provide food and medicine to French civilians. This was logistics operating at a level beyond pure military necessity. The Americans had sufficient capacity not just to support their own operations but to assist in humanitarian relief simultaneously. Schneider watched as American trucks delivered food supplies to a small French village that had been liberated just days earlier. The trucks were from the Red Ball Express, a massive logistics operation that employed hundreds of trucks driven around the clock to maintain supply flow to advancing units. The drivers, many of them African-American soldiers, operated in shifts that never stopped, moving 12,000 tons of supplies daily along designated routes that stretched from Normandy to the front lines. At the coastal prisoner compound where Schneider awaited transportation to England, he met a logistics officer from New Jersey, Captain Robert Mitchell, who spoke passable German. During a conversation, Schneider asked the question that had been troubling him since his capture. "How is this possible? How does your country, fighting on the other side of the ocean, supply armies larger than any in history while we, fighting in our own territory, cannot adequately supply forces a fraction of your size?" Mitchell considered the question carefully before answering. "We treat logistics as an industrial problem, not a military one," he explained. "We applied the same principles that make us efficient at producing automobiles and refrigerators. Standardization, mass production, continuous flow, redundant systems. And we have resources that war has not touched. Our factories operate without fear of bombing. Our infrastructure remains intact. Our workers are well-fed and productive. Schneider realized that Mitchell had identified the core difference. Germany had been at war for 5 years. Its factories were bombed regularly. Its transportation networks were degraded. Its workforce was depleted and malnourished. Its resources were stretched across multiple fronts. The Americans, protected by oceans and possessing vast internal resources, could dedicate their full industrial capacity to war production without the degradation that came from being a battlefield. This geographic advantage, combined with industrial methods that prioritized throughput over conservation, had created a logistics system that operated by entirely different rules. The flow of German prisoners to England and eventually to the United States provided thousands of officers and soldiers with direct exposure to the industrial base that supported Allied operations. Colonel Friedrich Hartmann, a divisional commander captured in September 1944, was transported by Liberty ship from France to Boston. The voyage itself was revelatory. The ship that carried him and several hundred other prisoners was less than a year old, one of hundreds constructed in American shipyards. It traveled in a convoy protected by destroyers and aircraft, crossing an ocean that Germany had once hoped to control through submarine warfare. Upon arrival in Boston, Hartmann was transferred to a train that would take him to a prisoner camp in the American Midwest. The train journey provided a view of industrial America that contradicted every propaganda message he had absorbed over the previous decade. City after city showed no signs of war damage. Factories operated with lights blazing through the night. Rail yards were filled with new equipment. Highway systems carried commercial traffic alongside military convoys. People on the streets appeared well-dressed and adequately fed. The country was simultaneously fighting a global war and maintaining a civilian economy that would have been considered prosperous in peacetime. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, Hartmann and his fellow officers were housed in facilities that exceeded the standard of many military installations in Germany even before the war. The barracks were heated, the food was abundant, the medical care was readily available. Hartmann began to understand that what he had witnessed on the battlefield, the endless supply trucks, the overwhelming firepower, the constant air support, was not the result of temporary sacrifice or desperate mobilization. It was the sustainable output of an economy operating at a level Germany had never achieved even at the height of its power. The psychological journey from confidence to disbelief to acceptance that Hartmann and thousands of other German officers experienced followed a similar pattern. Initial contact with American logistics capabilities produced skepticism. This must be exceptional, concentrated for specific effect. Then came the gradual realization that the abundance was universal and continuous. Finally came the crushing acceptance that Germany had been fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity rendered traditional military calculations irrelevant. Victory required not just tactical superiority but the ability to sustain operations over time. The Americans had built a system that could not be outfought because it could not be exhausted. By autumn 1944, as Allied forces approached Germany's western borders, the logistics machine Eisenhower had created was operating at peak efficiency. The supply lines that had seemed impossible to sustain now stretched from American factories across the Atlantic, through French ports, and along roads and railways to armies advancing on multiple fronts. The system handled not just the movement of supplies but the coordination of millions of individual requirements, from replacement boots for infantry to specialized parts for radar equipment. Nothing was forgotten, nothing was neglected, nothing was left to chance. General Oberst von Schreiber, now effectively sidelined by superiors who did not want to hear his pessimistic assessments, spent his final months before Germany's surrender compiling a comprehensive study of what had gone wrong. His analysis, discovered by Allied intelligence officers after the war, provided a remarkably clear-eyed view of German failures. "We approached logistics as a problem of allocation," he wrote. "We sought to distribute limited resources efficiently. The Americans approached logistics as a problem of production. They sought to eliminate limitations through industrial abundance. We tried to fight better with less. They simply ensured they never had less." The contrast could not have been starker. German quartermasters calculated precisely how many rounds each artillery piece could fire per day based on available ammunition. American artillery fired until targets were destroyed, knowing that resupply would arrive before guns went silent. German tank commanders hoarded fuel for critical moments. American tank columns refueled daily whether they needed to or not, ensuring that no unit ever entered combat without full tanks. German soldiers carefully maintained equipment because replacements were rare. American soldiers used equipment hard and replaced it when it wore out. These differences reflected not different military philosophies but different economic realities. The final vindication of Eisenhower's logistics plan came not in any single dramatic moment but in a sustained capacity to maintain pressure on Germany from multiple directions simultaneously. While Soviet forces pressed from the east, American, British, and Canadian forces advanced from the west, all sustained by supply systems that never collapsed under strain. When Germany launched its last major offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944, American logistics responded with speed and flexibility that German planners had deemed impossible. Supplies were rerouted, reserves were deployed, and the counterattack was sustained until German forces were not just stopped but destroyed. Major Ernst Fischer, captured during the Ardennes offensive, experienced the final proof of American logistics superiority during his transport to a prisoner camp in England. His journey took him through supply depots that covered square miles, past tank parks that held thousands of vehicles, alongside ammunition dumps that stretched beyond sight. "This is just the reserve," his guard explained. "The stuff that hasn't been needed yet." Fischer realized that Germany had been fighting not against American forces but against American potential. What was visible on the battlefield represented only a fraction of what could be deployed if necessary. The logistics system Eisenhower created supplied 16 million American military personnel across multiple theaters throughout the war. It moved over 7 million tons of supplies per month at its peak. It maintained operations across 2 oceans simultaneously. It supported forces fighting in climates ranging from Arctic to tropical. It coordinated the efforts of thousands of ships, millions of vehicles, and countless tons of material moving through a global network that spanned continents. And it did all of this while American cities remained unscathed, American factories continued civilian production alongside military output, and American citizens maintained living standards that exceeded those in any other warring nation. For the German officers who had laughed at Eisenhower's plans in 1943, the evidence of their miscalculation was overwhelming by 1945. They had assumed that logistical impossibility based on European experience and traditional military thinking. They had failed to account for American industrial capacity, geographic advantages, and organizational innovation. They had confused their own limitations with universal constraints. The result was a defeat determined not primarily by battles won or lost but by an industrial and logistics contest that Germany could never have won once America fully mobilized its resources. The laughter of March 1943 had been replaced by the silence of complete miscalculation, a strategic error written in millions of tons of supplies that flowed wherever American forces needed them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.